I drive the Blue Ridge Parkway more than most people. Not as a tourist, not for the views, not for the scenic overlooks where people pull off and take photographs and post them to social media with captions about God's country. I drive it because it's the fastest route between where I live in Boone and the hospital in Blowing Rock, where my father was being treated for lymphoma in the fall of 2021. The parkway connects the two without dropping down into the valley and climbing back up, which saves about 20 minutes compared to taking the state routes. And when your father is sick and the phone calls come at unpredictable hours, 20 minutes matters. I've been making the drive 2 or 3 times a week since September. Sometimes during the day when the road is busy with tourists and the views are the postcard version of themselves. Sometimes at night when the parkway becomes something else entirely. People who only know the Blue Ridge Parkway in daylight don't understand what it becomes after dark. The scenic overlooks turn into black voids. The guardrails, where they exist, become thin lines of reflective paint between you and a 1,000-foot drop. The trees close in from both sides until the road feels like a tunnel carved through living wood. Your headlight's the only light for miles in any direction. The curves coming at you with a regularity that requires constant attention and leaves no room for the mind to wander. It's beautiful in daylight and terrifying at night. And the terror isn't supernatural, it's physics. It's the knowledge that a single moment of inattention at 60 miles per hour on a road with no shoulder and no cell signal will send you off the edge of the mountain, and nobody will find you until spring. It was late November. My father had taken a bad turn the previous week, and I'd been spending more time at the hospital, sitting in the vinyl chair beside his bed, and watching the monitors and talking to him about nothing because the something was too heavy for either of us to carry in conversation. I'd left the hospital around 10:30, later than I usually did, and gotten on the parkway heading south toward Boone. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read 23 degrees. The sky was clear, no moon, just stars, and the absolute darkness of a mountain night in November when the leaves are gone, and the branches are bare, and the forest looks like a skeleton of itself. I was about 15 minutes into the drive, somewhere in the stretch between the Lynn Cove Viaduct and the Blowing Rock exit, when my headlights caught something on the right shoulder. I was in a gentle left-hand curve, the kind where your headlights sweep the outside edge of the road before the turn straightens, and in that sweep, the beams passed across a figure standing on the gravel shoulder. A woman. I registered 3 things simultaneously as the headlights touched her and moved on. White dress, bare arms, perfectly still. I eased off the gas. My first thought was an accident. Someone whose car had gone off the road and who was standing on the shoulder in shock, waiting for help. But there was no car, no debris, no skid marks. Just the woman, standing on the gravel in a white dress that looked like cotton or linen, thin fabric, sleeveless, the kind of thing you'd see at a summer garden party, not on the shoulder of a mountain road in 23-degree weather. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't hugging herself against the cold. She wasn't doing any of the things a body does involuntarily when exposed to temperatures that can kill you in hours. She was just standing there, facing the road, her arms at her sides, her body perfectly vertical, as if she'd been placed on that spot by something that had aligned her with the precision of a surveying instrument. I pulled over. I shouldn't have. Every instinct that 20 years of mountain driving had developed was telling me to keep going, to call the ranger station from the next area with cell signal, to let someone whose job it was handle whatever this was. But something about the scene overrode the instinct, the vulnerability of it. A woman alone on a dark road in a dress that offered no protection from the cold. The same impulse that makes you stop for a stranded motorist or a dog in the road. The human inability to drive past what looks like suffering without at least asking if help is needed. I rolled down the passenger window. The cold came in immediately, sharp and dry, the mountain air at elevation in November, carrying a bite that goes straight to the lungs. I leaned across the seat and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She turned her head, not her body, her head. A slow, smooth rotation from facing the road to facing me, the kind of movement that should involve the shoulders and the torso but didn't. Her body stayed perfectly aligned with the road while her head turned 90 degrees to look at me through the open window. I saw her face, and something in my chest went cold, not the cold of the air. A different cold, an internal one. The kind that starts behind the sternum and radiates outward until your fingers go numb and your vision narrows. She was normal. That's what was wrong. Her face was completely, unremarkably normal. A woman of indeterminate age, somewhere between 30 and 60, with features that were pleasant and forgettable in the way that faces are forgettable when they have no distinguishing characteristics. Pale skin, dark hair, a mouth that was neither smiling nor frowning, a face you'd pass on the street without a second glance, except for the eyes. The eyes didn't reflect. I need you to understand what I mean by that, because it's the detail that people focus on when I tell this story, and it's the detail that matters most. When headlights hit a person's eyes, the retina reflects the light. It's called eye shine. It's the same thing that makes animal eyes glow in photographs. It's involuntary, it's universal, and it's one of the ways your brain confirms that what you're looking at is a living thing with eyes that are receiving light. This woman's eyes didn't do that. The headlights were hitting her face full on, illuminating every feature with the harsh clarity of halogen beams at close range, and her eyes were absorbing the light without returning it. They were dark, not dark-colored. Dark the way a hole is dark, the way a cave entrance is dark, an absence where a reflection should have been, as if the light entered her eyes and never came back. I asked again, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" My voice sounded thin and unconvincing, even to me, the words of someone going through a social script while every nonverbal signal in the situation was screaming at them to leave. She didn't speak. Her mouth didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But she took a step toward the car. One step. Deliberate. The kind of step a person takes when they've been standing still for a long time and have decided, with a finality that doesn't invite reconsideration, that it's time to move. And when she moved, something hit me. Not physically, not through the window, but something changed in the air between us. A pressure, a density, like the moment before a thunderclap when the atmosphere compresses and your ears pop and the world goes tight around you. It was dread, not fear, which is sharp and specific. Dread, which is diffuse and total and comes from a part of the brain that's older than language. It pressed against me through the open window, like a hand pushing against my chest, and it carried with it a certainty that I have never felt before or since. The certainty that if I stayed, if I let her take another step, if I let her reach the car and touch the door and lean into the open window, something would happen that I could not undo. I rolled up the window. The barrier of glass between us felt laughably inadequate, but the act of closing it broke the paralysis. I put the car in drive, pulled onto the road, and I accelerated into the curve ahead with a force that pushed me back in my seat and made the tires protest against the cold asphalt. I looked in the rearview mirror. She was still on the shoulder, still in the white dress, still standing with that geometric precision, but she was facing the other direction now. She was facing me. In the time it had taken me to pull away, maybe 3 seconds, she had turned 180 degrees, not walked, not shuffled, turned, rotated in place like a figure on a music box, from facing the road to facing the direction I was driving. Her dark eyes pointed at my taillights as I put distance between us. She hadn't taken a step. She hadn't adjusted her posture. She'd simply turned, the way a compass needle turns to find north, orienting herself toward me with a precision that told me the road and the shoulder and the overlook were irrelevant. I was the reference point. She was facing whatever direction I was in. I drove the rest of the way to Boone at 80 miles per hour on a road with a speed limit of 45. I didn't slow down for curves. I didn't check the mirror again. I drove with my hands locked on the wheel and my eyes fixed on the road ahead and the heater blasting because the cold from the open window had settled into the car and into my body, and I couldn't get warm. I called the ranger station the next morning. I explained what I'd seen, trying to keep my voice factual, trying to sound like a concerned citizen reporting a potential hazard, rather than a frightened man describing something that had shaken the foundation of his understanding of how the world works. The ranger who answered was polite and unsurprised. He said they'd had reports of a woman on that stretch for years. He said it in the practiced tone of someone who has delivered this information before and has learned that certain details are best left vague. He said nobody had ever found anyone there during daylight. Search teams, rangers on patrol, maintenance crews, All of them had checked the area after nighttime reports and found nothing. No footprints on the shoulder, no fabric caught on branches, no sign that anyone had been standing where the witnesses said someone had been standing hours before. He said the reports always came from solo drivers. Always at night, always in November. He said this as if November were a sufficient explanation, as if the month itself were the cause rather than the context. I asked him if anyone had ever stopped and interacted with her. He was quiet for a moment, then he said one person did, about 6 years ago. A man driving alone, in similar circumstances, on the same stretch of road. He stopped, Dee got out of his car, and walked toward her. The ranger paused. He said the man was found the next morning sitting in his car at the overlook, about a quarter mile from where the woman had been reported. The car was running, the headlights were on. The man was in the driver's seat with his seatbelt fastened, his hands on the wheel, and his eyes open. He was alive, but he couldn't speak. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The doctors at the hospital in Boone said there was no physical cause for the muteness. No stroke, no injury, no trauma to the vocal cords or the brain regions that control speech. He simply could not produce words. He recovered his speech about 3 weeks later. When he did, the first thing he said was that she showed me. He wouldn't elaborate. He never said what she showed him. He moved out of the area within a month, and nobody in the ranger station has heard from him since. I didn't go back to the parkway at night after that. I took the state routes to the hospital, adding 20 minutes to each trip, and I made the drive in daylight whenever I could. My father died in January, 3 weeks after Christmas, and I stopped making the drive at all. But I think about that stretch of road more often than I'd like. I think about the woman in the white dress, standing on the shoulder in 23-degree weather without shivering. I think about the eyes that didn't reflect, and the steps she took toward my car, and the wall of dread that pushed through the open window like a living thing. And I think about the way she turned, that instant, mechanical rotation from one direction to the other, locking onto me like a tracking system, following my movement with a precision that had nothing to do with human anatomy and everything to do with purpose. The ranger said the reports are always in November. I've thought about that. November is when the leaves are gone and the branches are bare, and the Blue Ridge strips itself down to its bones, and the parkway runs through a landscape that looks less like a mountain road and more like a corridor through a place that's been emptied of everything. David and I got married in June of 2019 and spent our first anniversary trying to find a cabin in the Blue Ridge that wasn't either a plastic tourist trap or so far off the grid that we'd need a satellite phone to call for help if something went wrong. The compromise came through a rental listing that a friend of mine had forwarded, a restored cabin near Grandfather Mountain in Avery County that looked, from the photographs, like something out of a magazine spread on Appalachian charm. Stone fireplace, wide plank floors, a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder, and a porch that faced east toward a view of the Blue Ridge that the listing described as transformative. The price was high but not unreasonable for an anniversary, and the reviews were uniformly positive, the kind of 5-star assessments that use words like magical and unforgettable and once in a lifetime. We booked it for 3 nights in early June and drove up from Charlotte on a Friday afternoon with a cooler full of food, a bottle of champagne, and the particular, fragile optimism of 2 people who had survived their first year of marriage and wanted to celebrate the fact that they still liked each other. The cabin was at the end of a gravel road that climbed about a mile off the county route, winding through a tunnel of rhododendron and hardwood before opening into a clearing where the structure sat alone against a backdrop of mountain and sky. It was everything the photographs had promised, small but well-proportioned, built from hand-hewn logs that had been restored, chinked, and sealed with a craftsman's attention to detail. The stone fireplace dominated the main room, a massive hearth of native rock that rose from floor to ceiling and radiated the particular authority that stone architecture carries in these mountains. The sense of permanence, of a structure that has outlasted every person who has lived in it and will outlast every person who comes after. The sleeping loft was above the main room, open to the space below, accessible by a ladder built from the same logs as the walls. The porch wrapped around 2 sides, and the view was, as advertised, the kind of panorama that makes you stop talking and just look. David unlocked the front door and pushed it open, and the smell hit me before I crossed the threshold. Lavender. Dense, fresh, overwhelming. The concentrated floral intensity of a lavender field in full bloom, compressed into the interior of a small cabin with an almost aggressive potency. It wasn't a trace. It wasn't a hint. It was a wall of fragrance that pressed against my face when I walked through the door and filled my sinuses and my lungs with a sweetness so thick it was almost physical, like breathing through fabric soaked in essential oil. I stopped in the doorway. David walked past me, set the cooler on the kitchen counter, and started unpacking, apparently unbothered. I asked him if he smelled it. He paused, inhaled, and said, "Yeah, kind of floral. Maybe they use some kind of cleaner." He went back to unpacking. For him, it was background. For me, it was the dominant feature of the space, louder than the view, more present than the fireplace. A saturation of scent that I couldn't tune out no matter how long I stood in it. I opened the windows. The smell didn't diminish. I checked the bathroom for air fresheners, the closets for sachets, and the corners for diffusers. Nothing. The lavender wasn't coming from a source I could identify. It was in the woods, in the air, in the fabric of the curtains and the upholstery of the single armchair beside the fireplace, and the quilts folded at the foot of the bed in the loft. It was embedded in the cabin itself, as if lavender had been part of the building material, mixed into the chinking or rubbed into the logs until the oils had soaked into the grain. We settled in. David built a fire in the fireplace. CE and I made dinner, and we ate at the small table by the window and watched the sunset paint the Blue Ridge in shades of orange and purple, and finally a deep, bruised blue that faded to black. The champagne helped. The fire helped. The view helped. I stopped noticing the lavender the way you stop noticing any persistent stimulus after enough time, the way you stop hearing the hum of a refrigerator or the ticking of a clock. It receded into the background, and the evening became what it was supposed to be, warm and quiet and intimate. Two people in a cabin on a mountain remembering why they'd chosen each other. We went to bed around 10. The sleeping loft was cozy and warm from the fire below, the heat rising through the open space and settling into the quilts and the mattress with a comfort that felt earned. David fell asleep almost immediately, the way he always does, his breathing going slow and deep within minutes of closing his eyes. I lay beside him and looked at the log beams of the ceiling, close above my head in the loft, and listened to the fire pop and settle below, and the wind move through the trees outside. The lavender was stronger up here. I'd noticed it on the ladder, a progressive intensification with each rung, as if the scent rose with the heat and concentrated in the loft the way smoke concentrates at the ceiling of a room. It was heavier here, denser, with an almost liquid quality that coated the inside of my mouth when I breathed through it. I closed my eyes and felt it settle over me like a blanket. I slept, deeper than I've ever slept in my life. Not the gradual descent into unconsciousness that normal sleep follows, the slow dimming of awareness, the transition through light sleep and deep sleep and REM and back again, in cycles that the body navigates without conscious direction. This was different. This was a straight drop, a trapdoor beneath my consciousness that opened and let me fall into a darkness so total and so complete that it felt less like sleep and more like absence. No dreams, no awareness, no sense of time passing, position shifting, or the small physical adjustments that the body makes during normal rest. Just blackness. Deep, heavy, absolute blackness that held me the way water holds a stone, with a pressure that was both comforting and inescapable. I woke at 3 in the morning. The time was on my phone when I reached for it, but I knew it was 3 before I looked, the way you sometimes know the time without checking. A body clock precision that borders on instinct. The loft was cold. Not cool, not the natural temperature drop that happens when a fire burns down. Cold. The kind of sharp, penetrating cold that doesn't belong to a June night in the mountains. The kind that sits on your skin like water and makes your breath visible if there's enough light to see it. The fire was dead. Not embers, not coals, not the red-orange glow that a banked fire maintains through the night. Dead. The hearth was dark, and the stones were cold, and the cabin below the loft was a well of shadow that the moonlight from the windows couldn't reach. David was asleep beside me, his breathing unchanged, deep and steady, the sleep of someone who hasn't registered the temperature drop, or the dead fire, or whatever had pulled me up from the black depth of that unnatural rest. I lay there, and I looked at the ceiling beams above me, and I listened. The humming started from somewhere very close. Not below in the main room, not outside. Here, in the loft. A low, tuneless sound. The kind of absent vocalization that a woman makes when she's working. The hum you produce when your hands are busy and your mind is occupied, and the sound comes out of you without intention or awareness. It had no melody, no rhythm, just a sustained, wavering tone that rose and fell slightly with what sounded like breathing, as if someone was humming on the exhale and inhaling silently and humming again. The sound was intimate, close. The distance of a person sitting in a chair across the room, or standing at a counter, or kneeling on the floor, engaged in a task that required their hands and left their voice free to fill the silence. The lavender was overwhelming. It hit me in the same moment I became aware of the humming, a surge of fragrance so intense that my eyes watered and my throat constricted, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. It was coming from the same direction as the humming, from the far end of the loft, the section beyond the bed, where the ceiling sloped down to meet the floor, and the space narrowed to a triangular alcove that I hadn't paid much attention to during the day. The humming and the lavender were occupying the same space, emanating from the same point, as if the sound and the scent were two expressions of a single presence. I didn't move. I lay on my back in the cold loft with the quilts pulled to my chin, and I stared at the ceiling, and I listened to the humming, and I breathed the lavender, and I felt something that I can only describe as being attended to, not watched, not threatened, attended to. The way you feel when someone is in the room with you, and they're not looking at you, but they're aware of you. The way a mother is aware of a sleeping child, the way a nurse is aware of a patient. A presence that was there because I was there, that was humming because humming is what you do when you're keeping company with someone asleep and you don't want to wake them, but you don't want them to be alone. It lasted maybe 20 minutes. The humming maintained its quiet, tuneless constancy, and the lavender held its intensity, and the cold stayed in the air like a signature. Then the humming faded, not stopped, faded, the way a sound fades when the source moves away, growing gradually quieter, each hum a little softer than the last, until the sound was less than a whisper, and then less than a thought, and then gone. The lavender eased with it, retreating from overwhelming to strong, to moderate, to faint over the same period, as if the scent was attached to whatever was leaving and was being carried away with it. I didn't climb down from the loft. I didn't wake David. I lay in the dark, and I waited for dawn, and I told myself that I'd imagined it, that the lavender was an environmental factor, and the humming was the wind, and the cold was the dead fire, and the feeling of being attended to was the lingering effect of the deepest sleep I'd ever experienced. I almost believed it. I almost made it to morning with my rational framework intact. Then the light came. Gray at first, then gold, the June sunrise reaching through the east-facing windows and climbing the walls and reaching the loft in a warm wave that dissolved the cold and illuminated the space with a clarity that left nowhere to hide. I sat up in bed and looked at the far end of the loft, the triangular alcove where the humming had been. On the floor, arranged in a circle about 2 feet in diameter, were dried lavender stalks. A dozen or more, their stems crossed at the center and their flower heads pointing outward, forming a pattern that was too precise to be accidental and too deliberate to be natural. The stalks were dry and brittle, and they looked old. The flowers faded from purple to gray, the stems papery and fragile. But they smelled fresh. They smelled like the cabin. They smelled like the loft at 3 in the morning when the humming was close, and the cold was deep, and something was sitting in the dark keeping me company while I slept. David found me staring at the circle when he woke up. He looked at it and said, "Huh, those weren't there yesterday." He said it with the mild curiosity of a man who notices something unusual but doesn't assign it weight. I didn't tell him about the humming. I didn't tell him about the cold or the smell or the feeling of being attended to. I told him it was probably decorative, something the cleaning crew left, and he accepted it and went downstairs to make coffee. I called the property manager that afternoon. I described the lavender circle and the smell and, hesitantly, the humming. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me about Iva. The cabin's original owner was a woman who had built the structure in her 30s with her husband and who had lived in it alone after he died in 1947. Iva grew lavender. The hollow where I grew up doesn't have a name on any map. People in Watauga County called it the Presnell Hollow, after the family that settled there before the Civil War. But the Presnells had been gone for generations by the time my grandparents bought the property in 1968, and the name survived only in the speech of old-timers, who remembered when every hollow and ridge and creek bend in the Blue Ridge had a name that meant something to someone. To me, it was just home. A small white house at the end of a gravel road that followed a creek through a narrow valley between two ridges so steep and so close together that the sun only reached the yard for about 6 hours a day in winter. My grandparents raised my mother there, and after my father left when I was 4, my mother brought me back, and that's where I grew up, in a house that smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the particular mineral scent of creek water that runs over blue stone. The creek was the center of everything. It came down off the Blue Ridge from somewhere above 4,000 feet, gathering from springs and seeps and tiny tributaries that merged as they descended, until by the time the water reached our property, it was a proper creek, maybe 8 feet wide and a foot deep in most places, running clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones that my grandmother said had been washing down the mountain since before God had a name for the place. The creek ran through the back of our property about 50 feet from the house, separated from the yard by a wire fence that my grandfather had put up not to keep animals out, but, my grandmother said, to mark the line. I asked her what line was when I was about 8 years old. She looked at me the way she looked at me when I asked questions that she thought I was too young for, and said the line between where we live and where other things do. My grandmother was not a woman given to fantasy or superstition in the conventional sense. She was practical and clear-eyed, and had the particular mountain pragmatism that comes from a life lived close to the ground, where survival depends on accurate observation rather than wishful thinking. She could read the weather by the color of the sky, and predict frost by the behavior of the woolly worms, and tell you which plants would cure a headache and which would stop your heart. She dealt in facts. But her facts included a category that most people's facts don't, a set of truths about the hollow and the creek and the mountain above, that she conveyed with the same matter-of-fact authority she used when telling me how to can tomatoes or split kindling. The gate was about a quarter mile upstream from the house. 2 boulders, each about the size of a car, D against each other over the creek to form a natural arch. The water flowed through the gap between them, narrowing to maybe 3 feet as it passed beneath the stones before widening again on the other side. The boulders were gray and lichen-covered and had been there, according to my grandmother, since the mountain put them there, which was her way of saying forever. She told me when I was 6 years old that I was never to follow the creek past the gate. She said it the way she said everything important, once, clearly, with an eye contact that communicated the seriousness of the instruction more effectively than repetition could have. She said the creek brings things down from the mountain, and the gate is where they stop. She said, as long as you stay on this side of the gate, you're in our hollow. Past the gate, you're in theirs. I didn't ask who they were. I was 6. The instruction was clear, and the authority behind it was absolute, and I filed it in the same mental category as don't touch the stove when it's hot and don't go near the road when a car is coming. Rules that existed for reasons I didn't need to understand to obey. I obeyed for 8 years. Then my cousin Tyler came to visit for a week in the summer when I was 14. Tyler was from Hickory, a town kid, confident and loud, and exactly the kind of influence that my grandmother watched with the same wariness she watched the weather. He was 2 years older than me, and he had the particular authority that 2 years of age confers in adolescence, the ability to make a younger cousin feel simultaneously admired and inadequate. We spent the week exploring the property, swimming in the creek, building fires in the yard, and doing the kinds of things that teenage boys do in the mountains when there's no internet and no television, and the nearest friend is a mile away. On the 4th day, Tyler asked where the creek came from. I pointed upstream. He asked what was up there. I said I didn't know, because my grandmother had told me not to go past the gate. He looked at me with the expression that I'd been dreading all week, the particular mix of amusement and contempt that 16 directs at 14, when 14 admits to obeying a rule set by a grandmother. He said, let's go see. I said no. He said, "Come on." I said, "My grandmother said not to." He said, "Your grandmother also probably thinks the earth is flat and cell phones cause cancer." I said, "She doesn't think either of those things." He said, "Then what's she think is up the creek that's so dangerous?" I didn't have an answer. I'd never asked. The rule existed without explanation, and I'd never questioned it. And now, standing in the yard with Tyler, looking at me like I was the most timid person he'd ever met, the absence of explanation felt like an absence of reason. We went past the gate at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday in July. The boulders were as massive and as permanent as they'd always been, the creek flowing through the gap between them with a steady murmur that I'd been hearing my entire life. We ducked under the arch, stepped over the water, and came out on the other side, and I felt something change. Not dramatically, not like crossing into another world, more like a shift in pressure, the way your ears adjust when you drive up a mountain, a subtle recalibration that you feel more than you think about. The air was different, cooler. The light was different, greener. The forest on this side of the gate was older than the forest on our side, the trees taller and thicker, the canopy so dense that the ground beneath was bare, no undergrowth, no ferns, no wildflowers, just a carpet of dark leaf litter and the smooth, massive trunks of trees that had been growing undisturbed for what looked like centuries. Tyler was ahead of me, moving along the creek with the confident stride of a person who has never been told that confidence and safety are not the same thing. I followed. We walked for maybe half a mile, the creek narrowing as we climbed, the forest growing denser and darker, the sound of the water changing from the bright chatter of our section to a deeper, lower murmur that seemed to come from further below the surface. And then the creek widened, and we found the pool. It was circular, perfectly geometrically circular, maybe 15 feet in diameter, where the creek expanded into a basin that had been carved from the bedrock by some process that I didn't understand. The water feeding into it was clear and moving. The water in the pool was dark, not muddy, not stained, dark in the way that deep water is dark, the way the ocean is dark when you're far enough from shore that the bottom disappears and the color shifts from blue to black. The pool shouldn't have been that dark. The creek was shallow everywhere else, a foot or two at most. But this pool was dark, the way something is dark when the bottom is much further down than the surface suggests. Tyler knelt beside it and looked in. He said he couldn't see the bottom. He picked up a stone and threw it in. I watched it hit the surface. The stone entered the water, and the water didn't ripple. The surface absorbed the impact the way a thick liquid absorbs a drop, the stone passing through without disturbing the plane, without sending out concentric rings, without making the sound that a stone makes when it hits water. It was silent. The pool took the stone the way you'd take something handed to you, accepting it without reaction, closing around it without resistance. Tyler threw another stone. Same thing, no ripple, no splash, no sound. He looked at me, and his confidence had dimmed slightly, replaced by something he was working to conceal, an uncertainty that 16-year-old boys from Hickory aren't supposed to show. He said, "It's probably just really deep and still." I didn't respond. I was looking at the pool and feeling something I couldn't name, a pull, a gentle but insistent tug that seemed to originate from the dark water and direct itself at the center of my chest. Not inviting, not threatening, just aware. The pool was aware of me the way an eye is aware of what it's looking at. I said we should go back. Tyler, for once, didn't argue. We walked back downstream, past the old trees and the bare ground and under the gate, and by the time we reached the yard, the pull had faded, and the afternoon felt normal again, and Tyler was talking about something else, and I told myself the pool was just a pool, and the stones didn't ripple because the water was too still, and the darkness was because the bottom was deep, and everything had an explanation that didn't require me to acknowledge what I'd felt. That night, I went to bed around 10. My room was on the second floor of the house, a small bedroom with a window that faced the backyard and the creek beyond the fence. The window was open because it was July, and the house didn't have air conditioning, and the sound of the creek was my lullaby, the same sound I'd fallen asleep to every night of my life. I lay in bed and listened. The creek murmured. The wind moved through the trees. The house settled. And then, around midnight, I heard something in the creek. Not the normal sound of water over stones, a disruption, A splashing, rhythmic, heavy, the sound of something moving through the water, coming downstream. Step, pause, step, pause. A cadence that was too slow for an animal, too regular for debris washing down in a current, too deliberate for anything that wasn't choosing to move at exactly that pace. It was walking. Something was walking down the creek from the direction of the mountain, from the direction of the gate, moving through the shallow water with a patience that suggested it was in no hurry because it knew exactly where it was going. I went to the window. The yard was silver in the moonlight, the grass pale, the fence a dark line between the mowed ground and the creek bank. The creek itself was a ribbon of reflected light, the water catching the moon and throwing it back in fragments. I couldn't see anything in the water. The sound was close now. Within 100 yards, the splashing growing louder and more distinct. Step, pause, step, pause. Each step produced a heavy splash that sent water up onto the banks, the kind of displacement that comes from something large enough to fill the creek bed. It stopped. At the back fence, I could hear where it was by the sound of the water settling around it, the creek readjusting its flow around an obstacle that hadn't been there a moment before. The splashing ceased. The creek murmured. And from the darkness at the fence line, from the space between the yard and the water, something breathed, deep, slow, the breath of a large body at rest. Exhale. I've hiked the Rhone Highlands more times than I can count. That section of the Appalachian Trail runs along the highest balds in the southern mountains, open grassland above 5,000 feet, where the wind blows constantly and the views on a clear day extend 50 miles in every direction, and the sky feels close enough to touch. The balds are one of the ecological mysteries of the southern Appalachians. Treeless meadows at elevations where the climate should support forest, their existence unexplained by any single theory that ecologists have proposed. Some say fire maintained them. Some say grazing by elk and bison before Europeans arrived kept the trees from taking hold. Some say the soil conditions at those specific elevations prevent tree growth. And the old mountain people, the ones who lived in the hollows below the balds before the AT was blazed and the tourists arrived, said the balds were kept open by something that didn't want trees there, something that needed the high ground clear for reasons it didn't explain to the people who lived below. I'm a trail maintainer. I volunteer with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and I'm assigned a section of the AT that runs through the Rhone Highlands in Carter County, Tennessee, and Mitchell County, North Carolina. My job is to hike the section twice a month from spring through fall, clear deadfall, maintain blazes, check drainage structures, and report any damage or hazard that needs a work crew. It's solitary work, and I prefer it that way. The section I maintain runs about 8 miles, from Carver's Gap to the summit of Rhone High Knob and back, crossing some of the most spectacular and most exposed terrain on the entire 2,000-mile trail. The balds up there are enormous, rolling fields of grass and wildflowers, and low shrubs that stretch across the ridgeline like the back of a sleeping animal. And when the weather is good, they're the most beautiful landscape I've ever walked through. When the weather is bad, they're the most dangerous. The fog came in around 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late September of 2023. I'd been doing a routine maintenance hike, starting at Carver's Gap and heading north along the ridgeline toward Round Bald and then Jane Bald. The morning had been clear and warm for September, the kind of fall day that makes you forget winter is coming. The sky blue and the grass gold, and the air carrying just enough coolness to remind you that summer was over but not enough to make you reach for a jacket. I was on the open bald between Round and Jane when I saw the fog building to the west, a wall of gray that was climbing the Tennessee side of the ridge with a speed that told me I had maybe 15 minutes before it reached the summit. Fog on the balds is a known hazard. The open terrain that makes the view spectacular also makes navigation in low visibility extremely difficult. There are no trees to serve as landmarks. The trail is marked by wooden posts, driven into the ground at intervals, but in thick fog, you can lose sight of one post before you can see the next. Hikers get disoriented. They wander off the trail. They follow the slope of the bald in a direction they think is correct and end up on the wrong side of the ridge, descending into a drainage that leads away from the trail and into miles of trackless forest. The balds have been the site of multiple search and rescue operations over the years, almost all of them in fog. The wall of gray reached the ridgeline and swallowed me in less than a minute. One moment, I could see the trail posts stretching ahead of me in a line that followed the crest of the bald toward Jane. The next moment, I was inside the fog, and the posts were gone, and the grass was gone, and the sky was gone, and the entire world had contracted to a sphere of maybe 15 feet around me, within which I could see the ground beneath my boots and the grass immediately around me and nothing else. The fog was dense, not the wispy, transparent fog that drifts through hollows on cool mornings. This was opaque, a white-gray wall with the consistency of cotton, the moisture so thick that it condensed on my eyelashes and my jacket and the screen of my phone, and coated everything with a layer of water that was not quite rain. I stopped walking. Standard protocol. When fog takes the balds, you stop, you orient yourself, and you wait for it to thin enough to identify a trail marker or a landmark. I pulled out my compass and noted the direction I'd been walking, checked my position on the topo map I carried in my pack, and stood still. That's when the silence began. Not the gradual diminishment of sound that happens when fog dampens acoustic energy, which is a real and measurable phenomenon. This was abrupt, total. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west all day at maybe 10 or 15 miles per hour, stopped. Not eased, stopped. One moment, it was pushing against my face and pulling at my jacket and making the grass bend and hiss. The next moment, the air was still. Absolutely, perfectly still. Without the faintest movement, without the slightest breath of wind against my skin or my ears, or the exposed backs of my hands. The birds stopped. I'd been hearing them all morning, the calls of juncos and sparrows and the occasional hawk circling above the bald. Gone. The insects stopped. The late-season grasshoppers had been clicking in the grass around my feet all day. Silent. Every ambient sound that I'd been hearing for hours, the layered acoustic environment of a mountain bald in September, simply ceased. As if someone had pressed a mute button. As if the fog had swallowed not just the light but the sound, absorbing every vibration and leaving me in a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat and the blood rushing in my ears. I stood in that silence for maybe 5 minutes. I didn't move. The fog didn't thin. The wind didn't return. The birds didn't resume. I was standing in a sphere of white nothing, 15 feet in diameter, surrounded by a world that had gone quiet in a way that I had never experienced in 20 years of hiking these mountains. After 10 minutes, I made a decision. The fog wasn't passing. The silence wasn't broken. Standing still was getting me nowhere except cold and increasingly uneasy. I checked my compass. North. The trail continued north along the ridgeline. I oriented myself and started walking, counting my steps, keeping the compass in my left hand and my eyes on the ground directly in front of me. I walked 200 paces. At my stride length, that's roughly 200 yards. The ground beneath me was consistent with the bald, short grass and rocky soil and the occasional low shrub. But when I stopped and looked up from the compass, the landscape around me had changed. Not dramatically, not impossibly, but noticeably. The grass was different, longer, and a different color, darker green, instead of the gold that the September frost had been turning it. The rocks in the soil were arranged differently, clustered rather than scattered, as if the ground I was walking on had a different geological history than the ground I'd been walking on 10 minutes before. And there was a wall, directly ahead of me, running across the bald from left to right, disappearing into the fog in both directions. A stone wall, waist-high, maybe 3 feet, built from flat stones stacked without mortar in the dry stack technique that farmers in these mountains have used for centuries. The stones were gray and heavy and covered with lichen, the pale green and orange crusts that grow on rock surfaces over decades. And the wall had the settled, permanent look of a structure that had been there for a very long time. There are no stone walls on the Rhone Highlands. I need to be specific about this because it's the detail that everything else depends on. I have hiked every maintained trail on Rhone Mountain. I have walked the balds from Carver's Gap to Grassy Ridge and back more times than I can count. I have read the historical surveys, the ecological assessments, the Civil War records, and the accounts of early settlers. There is no stone wall on the open bald between Round and Jane. There never has been. The balds were grazed by livestock for centuries, but the fencing was wooden and wire, not stone, and none of it survives. The terrain is grass, rock, and shrub, and nothing else. no stone wall. But I was touching it. I put both hands on the top course of stones, and I felt them, cold and solid and real. The rough texture of lichen under my palms, the slight wobble of a stone that had settled unevenly, the grit of decomposed rock in the joints between them. The wall was real. It was physical. It occupied space and had weight, and responded to my touch with the unmistakable solidity of stone architecture built by human hands for a purpose that required a line across the landscape. I followed it. I turned right and walked along the wall with my left hand trailing on the top course, feeling the stones pass under my fingers one by one, counting them involuntarily the way you count anything repetitive. The wall was well built, the courses level, the stones fitted with the interlocking precision that comes from experience and skill. Whoever built this wall knew what they were doing. The stones were selected for flatness and uniformity, and placed with the weight distribution that keeps a dry stack wall standing for generations. I walked for maybe 100 feet, the fog pressing in from all sides, the silence holding, the wall running straight and true beneath my hand. Then the fog began to lift. It happened gradually, the white thinning by degrees, the sphere of visibility expanding from 15 feet to 20 to 30. As the light returned and the landscape emerged, the wall changed. The stones under my hand became lighter, not lighter in weight, lighter in appearance, the gray darkening to a pale translucence, the lichen fading, the edges softening. The wall was losing definition, not crumbling, not falling, fading. The stones were becoming less solid, less present, less real, the way an image fades when you adjust the opacity, the substance draining out of the form while the form remains. I pressed harder. My hands sank into the stone, not through it, into it, as if the stone had the consistency of cold clay, yielding slightly under pressure, accepting my palm with a softness that stone should never have. I pulled my hand back. The stone was intact, the surface unbroken, but the impression of my fingers remained for a moment, shallow dents in the lichen that filled in and disappeared as I watched. The fog thinned further. The wall continued to fade. I could see through it now, see the grass on the other side as if looking through frosted glass, the form of the wall still present but increasingly transparent, increasingly insubstantial, as if the stones were made of something that required the fog to maintain its solidity. The fog was lifting, and the wall was leaving with it, dissolving from the physical into something that was still visible but no longer tangible, a memory of a wall, an afterimage of stone, held in the air for a few more seconds by whatever principle had made it real. My hand was touching nothing. The last stone faded under my palm. And I was standing on the open bald with my arm extended and my hand resting on empty air. The wall was gone, not behind me, not ahead. Gone entirely, dissolved into the returning clarity of a September afternoon on the Rhone Highlands. The grass was gold again. The rocks were scattered. The trail was 10 feet to my left, the wooden posts visible in a line stretching north toward Jane Bald. The sounds came back. Wind first, a gentle push from the west that lifted my hair and pressed against. The cemetery has been part of the property for as long as anyone in my family can remember. It sits on a knob of land about 300 yards uphill from the house. A small plot of maybe 20 graves, enclosed by an iron fence that was decorative once and is rusted now, the posts leaning slightly inward as if the hill has been pressing on them from the outside. The graves span about 100 years, from the 1850s to the 1960s, a collection of Ramseys and Plumbers and Buckners who lived and died within a few miles of this ridge in Madison County and were carried up the hill and buried in the rocky soil and left there to keep watch over the valley below. The headstones are a mix of carved granite and rough fieldstone, some with names and dates still legible, others worn smooth by weather and time, until the inscriptions are nothing but shadows in the grain. My parents bought the property in 1985, the year I was born. They got it cheap because the house needed everything: a new roof, new plumbing, new wiring, and because the cemetery came with it, which discouraged buyers who didn't want 20 dead strangers on their land. My parents didn't mind. My mother, who grew up in a hollow in Yancey County where the family graveyard was in the front yard, said the dead were better neighbors than the living. My father, who was a practical man with no patience for sentiment, said the cemetery was above the house and therefore not his problem. Gravity would keep it where it was. When I was a child, the cemetery was a distant feature of the landscape, a dark rectangle on the hillside visible from the yard but too far away to make out details. I knew it was there, the way I knew the ridgeline was there, and the creek at the bottom of the hollow was there. A fixed element of the geography that I accepted without examining. The headstones were gray shapes against the green of the hillside in summer, and the brown of the dead grass in winter, and the iron fence was a thin, dark line that separated the graves from the surrounding pasture. From the yard, it looked small and remote and harmless, a postage stamp of history pasted onto the slope above us. By the time I was in high school, I could read the names on the tallest monuments. I noticed this one afternoon in my junior year, standing in the yard waiting for the school bus and looking up at the ridge the way I did every morning. The cemetery looked closer, not dramatically, not in a way that would startle you, but the headstones that had been featureless gray shapes when I was 10 were now legible, the carved letters visible from 300 yards in a way that shouldn't have been possible unless the distance had changed. I mentioned it to my father. He said the trees between the house and the cemetery had been thinned for firewood over the years, opening up the sightline and making the headstones appear closer. A reasonable explanation, a practical explanation, the kind of explanation my father specialized in. My mother had a different one. She said the cemetery was moving. My mother was not a dramatic woman. She didn't make claims for effect or exaggerate for attention. She was quiet and observant, and she spoke about the world around her with the measured precision of a woman who had been paying close attention to things for a very long time. When she said the cemetery was moving, she said it the way she'd say, "The creek is up" or "the wind is shifting," as a statement of observed fact, without commentary or editorializing. She said she'd been watching it for years. She said the whole plot, the fence, the headstones, and the ground they sat on were shifting downhill, toward the house, slowly, imperceptibly, but measurably. She proved it. One Saturday in the spring of my senior year, she drove a metal stake into the ground beside the lowest fence post of the cemetery, the post closest to the house. She ran a tape measure from the stake to a mark she'd made on the foundation of the house. 312 feet. She wrote the number on a piece of paper and taped it to the inside of the kitchen cabinet where she kept her recipes, her bills, and the other records of a life managed with quiet competence. The following spring, she measured again, 304 feet. She wrote the number on the paper beside the first. The year after that, 297 feet. Same stake, same foundation mark, same tape measure, 7 feet. The cemetery had moved 7 feet closer to the house in 1 year, and then 7 more, and then 7 more. The consistency was what unsettled her, I think. Erosion doesn't move at a constant rate. Soil creep doesn't produce the same displacement year after year with mathematical precision. The hillside wasn't sliding. The soil between the cemetery and the house wasn't displaced or disturbed. The pasture grass grew normally. The rock outcroppings that dotted the slope between the 2 points were in the same positions they'd always been. Their lichen-covered surfaces undisturbed, their relationship to the surrounding terrain unchanged. Nothing else on the hillside was moving. Only the cemetery, only the 20 graves, and the iron fence, and the headstones, and whatever lay beneath them in the rocky soil of the ridge. My father maintained his position. Soil creep, he said. Gravity acting on a hillside over time. The fact that the trees had been removed accelerated the process. The consistency of the measurement was a coincidence or measurement error. He said these things with the conviction of a man who needed them to be true because the alternative was something he couldn't accommodate in his understanding of how the world worked. My mother stopped measuring when the distance dropped below 200 feet. She didn't announce this decision. She simply stopped going out with the tape measure in the spring and stopped writing numbers on the paper in the cabinet. I found the paper years later, after she'd passed, a column of figures descending from 312 to 193, 7 years of measurements, 7 feet per year, 49 feet of ground consumed by the slow, patient advance of a graveyard down a hillside toward a house where living people slept. The closest headstone became readable from the kitchen window around the time I left for college. I was home for Thanksgiving my freshman year, standing at the sink washing dishes, when I looked up through the glass and read the inscription on the nearest monument. The stone was gray granite, tall enough to catch the afternoon light, and the carved letters were sharp enough to read from what I estimated was about 170 feet. The name was Ramsey, Edith Ramsey, dates that put her birth in the early 1900s and her death in the 1960s. I didn't know who she was. None of the names in the cemetery meant anything to me. They were strangers, dead strangers, the previous tenants of a piece of land that my parents had purchased and that the dead apparently hadn't finished using. But the headstone that was closest to the house wasn't Edith Ramsey's. It was my grandmother's. My mother's mother, Clara Buckner, who had died in 1988 and been buried in the family cemetery at the top of the plot, in the position farthest from the house, on the highest point of the knob, as far uphill as a grave could be placed within the iron fence. She'd been buried there deliberately, my mother told me once, because Clara had asked to be put at the top of the hill where she could see the valley. The top of the hill, the farthest point from the house. That's where they'd put her in 1988. And now she was the closest. The geometry of it was impossible to reconcile with any natural process. If the entire plot was sliding downhill at a uniform rate, the graves at the bottom of the slope would be closest to the house, which is how they'd been arranged when the cemetery was established. The oldest graves were at the bottom, nearest the house, and the newest were at the top, farthest away. That was the order, bottom to top, old to new. But the movement had rearranged them. My grandmother's grave, which had been at the top in 1988, was now at the bottom, the closest grave to the house, the first headstone you could read from the kitchen window. The plot hadn't just slid, it had rotated. The graves had reordered themselves during their descent, the newest grave migrating to the front of the procession, as if the dead were walking downhill in reverse chronological order, the most recent death leading the way. I mentioned this to my father. He looked at me for a long time and then went back to his newspaper. My mother, who was standing at the counter, said nothing. But that night, after my father had gone to bed, she came to the living room where I was reading and sat down across from me and said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Your grandmother didn't want to be up there." She said it with the flat, calm voice she used for things she believed absolutely. She said Clara had asked to be buried in the valley, near the creek, where she'd lived her whole life. But the family put her on the ridge because that's where the cemetery was. Because that's where you put your dead. My mother looked at me and said, "She's been coming down ever since." My father died in 2019. We buried him in the cemetery on the ridge, in a plot beside my grandmother. The last time I measured the distance, which was last spring, the fence line was 131 feet from the house. The kitchen window faces the closest headstone, which is still my grandmother's, and behind hers, in a row that follows the slope uphill, are the other graves in an order that no longer matches the order in which they were dug. My father's grave, the newest, is somewhere in the middle of the plot now, not at the top where we placed it in 2019. Somewhere in the middle, as if it's working its way forward, migrating toward the front, joining the procession that's been moving downhill for as long as my mother watched and longer. I live in the house now. I maintain the property. I mow the grass, fix the fences, and do the things that homeowners do to maintain the boundary between the lived-in and the left behind. But I don't measure anymore. I don't go out in the spring with a tape measure and record the distance between the cemetery and the house because I know what the number will be. And I know it will be 7 feet less than last year. And I know that the consistency of that number is something I cannot explain and do not want to examine. 7 feet a year, every year, unstoppable, unmotivated by any force that geology or physics can identify. At the current rate, the fence will reach the house in about 19 years. The closest headstone will be in the yard in about 15 minutes. And my grandmother, who has been leading the procession down the hill for 36 years, will be at the foundation of the house in about 12, which means that sometime around 2037 or 2038, the grave of Clara Buckner will have completed its journey from the top of the ridge to the back wall of the house, where her daughter lived and her granddaughter lives now. She'll be home. My Uncle Warren lived alone for the last 23 years of his life. He never married, never had children, and after he retired from the furniture factory in Marion, he retreated into the small house on the ridge outside Spruce Pine that he'd bought in the early 90s, and he stayed there. Not as a hermit exactly. He went to town for groceries and attended church on Christmas and Easter and kept up a nodding acquaintance with the neighbors, but as a man who had made peace with solitude and found in it something that company couldn't provide. I visited him once or twice a year, usually around the holidays, and each time the house seemed smaller and quieter and more thoroughly inhabited by his particular brand of stillness. He was a man who moved slowly and spoke rarely and sat for hours in his recliner looking out at the Black Mountains through the window and seeming entirely content with the view. He died in August of 2023. Heart failure, the doctor said. Though Warren had never complained of heart trouble and had been, by all accounts, in reasonable health for a man of 78. He was found in the recliner by a neighbor who checked on him after 3 days of uncollected mail. The coroner said he'd been dead about 48 hours. His face was peaceful. The television was off. A cup of coffee sat on the side table, cold and full, as if he'd poured it and set it down and died before he could drink it. I drove down from Asheville to handle things. I was the closest family member and the one Warren had named as executor, a role I accepted with the mixed feelings of a nephew who cared about his uncle but hadn't cared enough to visit more than twice a year. The house needed to be emptied, the accounts closed, and the property assessed. The lawyer in Spruce Pine said it would take a couple of weeks. I decided to stay at the house rather than commute, partly for convenience and partly because some guilty, sentimental part of me felt I owed Warren the presents I hadn't given him while he was alive. The house was a 2-bedroom on a ridge road about 4 miles outside of town. It was built in the 50s, a simple structure with board and batten siding, a metal roof, and a front porch that faced east toward the Black Mountains. On a clear morning, the view from that porch was extraordinary. The ridge of the Blacks running north to south against the sky like a wall, the highest peaks in the eastern United States, rising above the tree line in a blue-gray silhouette that changed color with the light. Warren had loved that view. The recliner was positioned to face it through the window, and the wear pattern on the carpet showed where he'd spent most of his waking hours, watching the mountains do what mountains do, which is nothing and everything at the same time. The first 3 nights were unremarkable. I slept in the guest bedroom, a small room at the back of the house with a double bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out at the tree line behind the property. I sorted through Warren's belongings during the day, boxing things for donation, setting aside papers for the lawyer, making the slow, respectful decisions that the living make about the possessions of the dead. In the evenings, I ate simple meals in the kitchen, read in the living room, and went to bed early, the house settling into its nighttime sounds around me, the ticking of the water heater, the creak of the roof contracting in the cool mountain air, the silence that old houses maintain like a held breath. On the 4th night, I woke up at 2 in the morning. I didn't wake gradually or gently. My eyes opened, and I was alert in an instant, in a complete way that happens when the body has detected something before the mind has processed it. The room was dark, not the total darkness of a windowless space, but the layered dark of a bedroom with a window, the glass showing a faint rectangle of starlight that provided just enough ambient illumination to see the shapes of the furniture, the dresser, the chair in the corner, the outline of the doorframe, and the man at the foot of the bed. He was standing about 3 feet from the footboard, directly centered, facing me. Not a shadow, not a pattern of light and dark that my brain was interpreting as a human form, a man. The 3-dimensional, fully proportioned shape of a man standing upright with his arms at his sides, his shoulders square, his head level. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, and thin in the way that mountain men of a certain generation are thin. The leanness of a body that has worked hard for decades and never carried more weight than it needed. He was wearing what appeared to be work clothes, a shirt and trousers of a dark color that I couldn't determine in the lack of light. I couldn't see his face. The darkness was too deep for features, but I could see the outline, the silhouette, the unmistakable shape of a person standing in my room, still and silent and oriented toward me with the focused attention of someone who has been watching for a while and has no intention of stopping. I reached for the lamp. My hand found the switch, and I turned it, and the light came on, and the room was empty. The foot of the bed was bare, The space where the man had been standing was unoccupied. I looked at the spot, and the spot looked back at me with the particular emptiness of a place that has just been vacated, the after-presence that lingers in a room when someone has left it, and the air hasn't finished rearranging itself around their absence. I checked the house. Every door is locked, every window sealed, the front door deadbolted, the chain engaged, the back door latched and bolted. The windows in both bedrooms are closed and locked from the inside. Nobody was in the house. Nobody could have been in the house. The place was sealed, and I was alone, and the man I had seen standing at the foot of my bed did not exist in any physical, material sense that I could verify. I went back to bed. I told myself I'd been dreaming. Hypnagogic hallucination, the vivid quasi-visual imagery that the brain produces in the transition between sleep and waking, is a well-documented phenomenon that explains the majority of bedroom apparitions and shadow people, and the man at the foot of the bed that thousands of people have reported seeing throughout history. I told myself this, and I believed it the way you believe something, because the alternative is not something you're equipped to accept at 2 in the morning in a dead man's house on a ridge in the mountains. The next night, the same thing happened. 2 in the morning, eyes open, man at the foot of the bed, same position, same height, same thin, work-clothed silhouette, same motionless, centered, absolute stillness. I reach for the lamp, light on, room empty. I checked the house, sealed. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. On the third night, I made a different choice. I woke at 2. I saw the man. I did not reach for the lamp. I lay on my back in the bed, and I looked at the shape at the foot of the bed, and the shape looked at me. We held each other's gaze in the dark. The shape and I, separated by 3 feet of air and whatever other distance exists between the seen and the unseen, the living, and whatever the man at the foot of the bed was. I want to describe what it felt like because the feeling is more important than the sight. It didn't feel threatening. It didn't feel malevolent. It didn't carry the dread or the fear that I would have expected from the presence of an unexplained figure in my bedroom in the middle of the night. It felt patient, watchful, the quality of attention that a person directs at something they've been observing for a long time and intend to go on observing. Not hostile, not friendly, just present, the way the mountains outside the window were present, existing in the darkness without requiring acknowledgement, there before I arrived and there after I left, occupying space with the quiet authority of something that belongs where it is. I lay there for 45 minutes. I know because I could see the clock on the nightstand in my peripheral vision. And I watched the digits change while the man at the foot of the bed didn't. He stood in the same position for the entire duration, motionless, patient, regarding me with an attention I could feel, like warmth from a source I couldn't see. And then, around 2:45, he began to fade. Not disappear, fade. The way a shape loses definition when the light changes, the edges softening, the density thinning, the solid form becoming translucent, and then transparent, and then absent, dissolving into the darkness of the room, the way smoke dissolves into still air. It took maybe 2 minutes. He was there, and then he was less there, and then he was a suggestion, and then he was nothing, and the foot of the bed was empty, and the room was just a room, and I was alone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night either. I sat up in bed with the lamp on, and I waited for dawn, and I thought about what I'd seen, and what it meant, and what I was going to do about it. The answer to the last question was nothing. There was nothing to do. I was staying in a dead man's house, and something was appearing at the foot of the bed at 2 in the morning and looking at me. And I could either leave, or I could stay. Why? And leaving felt like cowardice, and staying felt like something I owed Warren, though I couldn't have explained why. The next morning, I was going through Warren's desk, sorting papers into piles for the lawyer and the trash, when I found the photograph. It was in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns and a folder of receipts. A black and white photograph, about 4 by 6, with the slightly faded quality of an image from the mid-20th century. It showed a man standing on the front porch of this house. He was tall and thin, wearing work clothes, a dark shirt, tee and trousers, with his arms at his sides and his face turned toward the camera with an expression that was not a smile and not a frown, but something between. The look of a person who has been asked to stand still for a photograph and is complying without enthusiasm. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't Warren. He wasn't anyone I'd seen in family photos. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as Warren's, the small, precise print he used for everything from grocery lists to legal documents, were 8 words. He was here before us. He'll be here after. I sat at the desk, K, and I held the photograph, and I looked at the man on the porch, and I thought about the shape at the foot of the bed. The height was right. The proportions were right. The thin, work-worn body, and the squared shoulders, and the arms at the sides. The man in the photograph was the man in the bedroom, or whatever remained of him. Whatever had been standing in that house for long enough that Warren had written about it with the resigned familiarity of someone describing a permanent feature of the property, not a haunting but a condition, not an intrusion but a cohabitation. He was here before us. The house was built in the 50s. Warren bought it in the early 90s. Whoever the man in the photograph was, he predated Warren's occupancy by decades. And Warren had lived with him, 23 years in this house, alone, with a man who stood at the foot of the bed at 2 in the morning and watched. The Linville Gorge is one of the wildest places left in the eastern United States. 12 miles of canyon cut into the Blue Ridge by the Linville River, with walls that rise 1,000 feet on either side, and a river bottom that's accessible only by trails so steep and rough that most hikers turn back before they reach the water. The forest inside the gorge is old in a way that most Appalachian forests aren't, with stands of hemlock, white pine, and hardwood that survived the logging era because the terrain was too extreme for the timber companies to profitably extract them. Walking into the Linville Gorge feels like walking backward in time, away from the managed, maintained landscape of the Blue Ridge Parkway and the National Forest and into something older and less accommodating, a place that existed before people named it and will exist after people forget it. I've been camping in and around the gorge since I was 19. I'm 37 now, and I still go 3 or 4 times a year, usually solo, usually in the fall when the crowds thin out and the air gets sharp, and the gorge takes on the particular quality of light and shadow that makes it feel like the most beautiful and the most inhospitable place I know. I camp on the rim rather than the bottom because the descent is brutal, and the campsites along the river are exposed to flash flooding that can come without warning when it rains on the upper watershed. The rim sites are better, sheltered spots along the ridgeline where you can look down into the gorge and see the river 1,000 feet below, a silver thread winding through a canyon so deep the sun only reaches the bottom for a few hours a day. The trip was in mid-October of 2023. I drove up from Morganton on a Friday afternoon and parked at the Pine Gap trailhead on the west rim. The plan was a solo overnight, one night on the rim with a fire and a view and the silence that the gorge produces when the weekend hikers have gone home, and the only sound is the river and the wind and the particular acoustic emptiness of a place where the nearest road is 2 miles away and the nearest town is 10. I hiked about a mile south along the rim trail and found my spot, a flat shelf of rock and pine duff overlooking the gorge, sheltered by a stand of Table Mountain pine that broke the wind and provided enough dead wood for a small fire. I set up my tent, cooked dinner, and sat on the rim watching the sun go down behind Hawksbill Mountain on the far side of the gorge. The fog came in after dark. It rose from the river bottom, which is common in the gorge when the temperature drops and the moisture-laden air from the river condenses in the cooling atmosphere. It filled the canyon from the bottom up, a slow white tide that climbed the walls and settled into the valley like water filling a bathtub. By 10 o'clock, the gorge below my campsite was a solid sea of white, the fog thick enough to obscure the river and the trees and the rock walls, turning the canyon into a featureless void that began about 50 feet below the rim and extended to the opposite wall, which was invisible. I was camped above the fog, looking down at it from the rim, and the effect was otherworldly. A landscape divided into 2 zones, the clear, star-filled sky above, and the white, depthless fog below, with me sitting on the boundary between them. I went to bed around 11. The fog held steady, a white floor beneath the rim, and the night was quiet in the way that gorge nights are quiet, a deep, layered silence, broken only by the faint murmur of the river rising through the fog and the occasional call of an owl from the pines. I zipped into my sleeping bag, turned off my headlamp, and closed my eyes. The singing started sometime after midnight. I don't know the exact time because I didn't check. I was in the shallow end of sleep, that liminal zone where sounds from the outside world blend with the beginning of dreams. And it takes a moment to sort the real from the imagined. The singing was real. I knew it was real before I was fully awake, because it had a specificity that dreams don't achieve, a clarity of pitch and tone that my sleeping brain couldn't have generated on its own. Children's voices, high and thin, the soprano register of young children, maybe 5 or 6 years old, singing in unison. The sound was coming from below, from somewhere in the gorge, rising through the fog the way heat rises through water, diffused and softened by the moisture but clear enough to follow. A melody, simple, repetitive. A handful of notes arranged in a pattern that repeated every 8 or 10 seconds, each cycle identical to the last, each voice hitting the same pitches at the same intervals, with a synchronization that went beyond practice into something mechanical. There was no vibrato, no variation, no individuality in the voices. They sang as one, a single instrument composed of multiple sources, producing a sound that was pretty in the way that music box melodies are pretty, which is to say, precise and artificial and slightly wrong. I sat up in my tent and listened. The singing continued, rising from the fog, steady and unchanged. I tried to place the melody. It wasn't a hymn, though it had the modal quality of old sacred music, the kind of scale that sounds neither major nor minor to modern ears. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It was simpler than any children's song I knew, a 5-note phrase repeated without embellishment or development, the same handful of tones cycling through the same pattern, with the infinite patience of a recording set to loop. It felt old. Not old in the way that a folk song feels old, carrying the patina of generations and the fingerprints of every singer who's modified it. Old in a different way. Original. Like something that had been composed once and preserved exactly, without change, for a very long time. I unzipped the tent door and looked out. The fog was below me, a white ocean lapping at the rim, and the singing was coming from somewhere within it, from a point that I estimated was maybe 200 feet below my position, roughly halfway down the gorge wall, in a section of the canyon that I knew from daylight hikes to be sheer rock and loose scree, a technical descent that required ropes and experience and was impassable in the dark. No children were climbing those walls at midnight. No family was camped on the talus slopes halfway down a 1,000-foot canyon in the fog. The singing had no rational source. It rose from the white void below me, with the steady, unremarkable persistence of the river noise, as if it were a natural feature of the gorge, as ordinary as the water and the rock and the fog itself. I listened for 20 minutes. The singing didn't change. Same melody, same voices, same volume, same direction, no laughter between phrases, no adult voice calling out instructions or encouragement, no sound of movement or activity, no footsteps or rustling, or the 1,000 small noises that children make when they're awake and together. Just the singing, pure, mechanical, continuous. The voices of children performing a ritual that required nothing from them except repetition. Then it stopped, not gradually, not with a trailing final note, instantaneously. The singing was there, and then it was not there, and the silence that replaced it was so total and so abrupt that it had a physical quality, a pressure drop, as if the air had been compressed by the sound and expanded when the sound was removed. The fog remained. The river murmured. The night continued. But the silence where the singing had been was heavier than the silence before the singing started, charged with the absence of something that had been present and was now gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my tent, and I listened, and I heard nothing, and I waited for dawn with the focused patience of a person who needs daylight the way a drowning person needs air. The fog began to thin as the sun climbed behind the eastern rim, the white retreating down the canyon walls, revealing the rock and the trees and the river in stages, a slow uncovering that took about 30 minutes to complete. By 7, the gorge was clear, the fog reduced to wisps in the deepest shadows, and the canyon looked normal and solid and entirely free of children. I packed my camp and hiked down into the gorge. Not the technical descent from the rim, but a longer trail that switched back down the wall to the river about a mile south of my campsite. The descent took about 45 minutes and brought me to the river bottom, where I turned north and picked my way along the bank toward the section of gorge that corresponded to the position below my campsite, the place the singing had come from. The gorge bottom was narrow there, maybe 100 feet across, the river running through a corridor of boulders and old-growth hemlock. The walls rose on both sides, sheer rock faces streaked with mineral stains and draped with fern and moss. There was no trail, no campsite, no sign of human presence, just the river and the rock and the ancient forest, and the particular quality of light that exists at the bottom of a canyon where the sun arrives late and leaves early. I found it about 100 yards upstream from where I entered the gorge bottom. A circle of stones by the river, flat stones, smooth and water-worn, are arranged in a ring about 8 feet in diameter. The stones were large, each one maybe a foot across, and 3 or 4 inches thick, placed deliberately in a pattern that was too precise and too geometric to be natural. They sat on a flat section of riverbank, a rare piece of level ground in the gorge, and in the center of the circle was ash. Not fresh ash, not the gray and white remnants of a recent campfire. Dark ash, compacted, mixed with the soil beneath it in a way that suggested years of fires, decades of fires, the accumulated residue of flames that had been lit in this same circle so many times that the ash had become part of the ground itself. I knelt beside the circle and put my hand on one of the stones. It was cold. The ash in the center was cold. The whole site had the feel of a place that had been used and left, and used again over a period so long that the evidence of use had become geological. The stones were settled into the earth, the way fixtures settle, their edges buried, their surfaces flush with the surrounding soil, not placed on top of the ground but sunk into it by the weight of time. I didn't stay long. Something about the circle made me want to leave. Not fear exactly, but a sense of intrusion, the feeling of standing in someone else's space, a place that had a purpose I didn't understand and wasn't invited to participate in. I hiked out of the gorge and drove back to Morganton and sat in a coffee shop for an hour because I needed walls and light and the sound of other people and the smell of something being brewed by human hands. I've asked around about the circle. An old man in the Linville Falls community who's lived near the gorge his whole life said there are circles like that all through the canyon. Stone rings by the river with old ash in the center. He said the Cherokee knew about them and left them alone. He said they weren't Cherokee. They were older. He said the singing was older too. He said people have been hearing children's voices in the gorge for as long as anyone has lived near it. Always at night, always in fog, always the same melody, a song that nobody recognizes because nobody alive was there when it was first sung. He said the children in the song aren't lost. They aren't ghosts. They aren't echoes. They're singing because singing is what they were put there to do, the way the river was put there to run, and the rock was put there to stand. They're a feature of the gorge, as permanent and as old as the walls and the water, and the circles are where they gather. And the fires in the circles are fires that no living person lights. And if you're smart, he said, you listen from the rim, and you don't go down to where the singing comes from, because the singing isn't for you. It's for whatever listens in the deep parts of the gorge where the fog is thickest and the daylight never reaches, and you don't want to be there when it arrives. The mirror has been in the hallway of my grandmother's house for as long as anyone can verify, and probably longer. The house was built in 1904 by a family named Hensley, who lived in it until 1937, when they sold the property to a couple named Prophet, who sold it to my grandparents in 1962. The mirror was there when the Prophets bought the house. It was there when my grandparents bought it from the Prophets, and according to my grandmother, who asked Mrs. Prophet about it during the sale, it was there when the Hensleys sold to the Prophets, which means it was either installed when the house was built or placed there by the Hensleys at some point during their 33 years of occupancy. Nobody knows which. Nobody knows where it came from. It's just always been there, hanging on the same wall, in the same hallway, in the same house outside Burnsville in Yancey County, looking at whatever walks past it with the patient, unblinking attention of something that has been watching for over a century. It's an oval, about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, mounted in a carved wooden frame that was probably walnut once and has darkened over the decades to a color that's closer to black than brown. The carving is simple, a repeating leaf pattern that runs around the entire circumference of the frame, each leaf rendered with a precision that suggests a skilled hand and a sharp tool. The glass is original, or at least very old, with the faint greenish tint that antique glass develops as the chemicals in the composition shift over time. The reflection it produces is not quite accurate. Everything in the mirror looks slightly narrower and taller than in reality, as if the glass has a subtle concavity that stretches the image vertically. It's a small distortion. You wouldn't notice it unless you stood in front of the mirror and compared your reflection to what you could see by turning around and looking at the hallway directly. But once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. The hallway in the mirror is always slightly longer than the real hallway. The doorways are always slightly darker. The proportions are always slightly wrong, as if the mirror is showing you a version of the world that's almost, but not quite the one you're standing in. I was afraid of it as a child, not in the dramatic, scream and run way that children are afraid of things in movies. In the quiet, avoidant way that children are afraid of things in real life. The way you're afraid of a dog that hasn't bitten anyone but watches you too closely. The way you're afraid of a basement that has no reason to scare you, except that it does. I walked past the mirror every day when I visited my grandmother's house, which was often, since she lived only 20 minutes from our home in Burnsville, and my mother dropped me there regularly while she worked. I walked past it on the way to the kitchen, on the way to the bathroom, and on the way to the bedroom where I napped in the afternoons. And every time I walked past, I looked at it, not deliberately, involuntarily, the way your eyes are drawn to a sound, or a light, or any stimulus that your brain flags as significant. The mirror pulled my gaze, the way a magnet pulls iron, a gentle, persistent attraction that I resisted by looking away quickly, but could never entirely avoid. What I saw in the mirror was almost always explicable. My own reflection, distorted slightly by the old glass. The hallway behind me stretched and darkened by the same distortion. The doors to the bedroom, the bathroom, and the kitchen stand open, or closed depending on the hour. Normal things seen through abnormal glass. The mundane world filtered through a lens that made it look just wrong enough to unsettle without providing a concrete reason for the unease. But sometimes, I saw something else. At the very edge of the reflection, in the peripheral zone, where the mirror's view extended beyond what I could see by turning my head, there would be movement. Not dramatic, not a figure or a face or a hand reaching from behind a door, just movement. A shift in the quality of the shadow in a doorway, a change in the angle of a door that had been stationary. The suggestion of something retreating around a corner, pulling back from the mirror's view in the instant before my eyes reached the spot where it had been. It was always on the edge, always in the last quarter inch of the reflection where the glass met the frame, and it was always gone by the time I focused on it, leaving nothing but the slightly too long hallway and the slightly too dark doorways, and the feeling that something had been there and had moved and I had almost seen it. I told my grandmother about this when I was about 10. She was in the kitchen making biscuits, her hands white with flour, her face showing the calm, unimpressed expression she wore for most communications from grandchildren. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded and said the mirror shows more than it should. She said it the way she'd say the oven runs hot or the back door sticks in summer, as a statement of fact about a household item that had a particular characteristic. She said the prophets had noticed the same thing. She said Mrs. Prophet had told her that the mirror showed the hallway the way it used to be, not the way it is, the way it used to be. She didn't explain what that meant. And I didn't ask, because I was 10 and the biscuits were almost done, and the explanation would have required a conversation that neither of us was equipped to have. My grandmother said one other thing about the mirror that day. She said the prophets had tried to remove it, twice. The first time, Mr. Prophet took it off the wall and put it in the barn. In the morning, it was back on the wall, hanging from the same nail, in the same position, as if it had never been moved. The second time, Mr. Prophet took it off the wall and drove it to the dump in Marshall, and left it there. In the morning, it was back on the wall, same nail, same position. Mrs. Prophet said they stopped trying after that. My grandmother said she'd never tried to move it herself. She said she'd lived with it for 40 years, and it had never done anything except show her a hallway that was slightly longer and slightly darker than the one she was standing in, and she could live with that. My grandmother died in 2022. I inherited the house. I moved in that winter, partly because the property was paid for, and partly because I needed a place to live after a series of financial setbacks that had left me renting a room in Asheville that I could no longer afford. The house was small and old and needed work, but it was mine, or mine enough, and I settled into it with the particular gratitude of a person who has been without a home and suddenly has one. The mirror was there, same wall, same nail, same oval glass in its darkened frame. I walked past it on the first day and felt the same pull I'd felt as a child, the involuntary attraction of the gaze, the brief, unavoidable glance at the reflection, and the hallway within it. The distortion was the same. The hallway was still slightly longer in the mirror. The doorways were still slightly darker. The proportions were still wrong in the specific, consistent way that told me the distortion was a feature of the glass, not a trick of my perception. I decided to remove it. Not because of the distortion or the childhood memories or any specific fear, because I wanted the house to be mine, not a museum of my grandmother's choices, and the mirror was the most conspicuous artifact of her tenancy. It was heavy. I lifted it off the nail with both hands, surprised by the weight, the old glass, and the dense wooden frame combining to produce an object that must have weighed 30 or 40 pounds. I carried it to the garage and leaned it against the wall between a lawnmower and a stack of firewood. I went back to the hallway and looked at the wall where it had hung. A darker oval on the plaster marked its position, the surrounding paint faded by decades of light that the mirror had blocked. A single nail protruded from the center of the oval, rusty and bent slightly under the weight it had carried for 100 years. I went to bed that night in the back bedroom, the room where I'd napped as a child, and I slept well. In the morning, I made coffee and walked down the hallway to the kitchen, and I stopped. The mirror was on the wall. Same nail, same position. The glass catches the morning light from the kitchen window and throws it back with a faintly greenish tint. The hallway in the reflection was slightly longer than the hallway I was standing in. The doorways were slightly darker. Everything was exactly as it had been the day before, as if I had never touched it, never lifted it off the nail, never carried it to the garage and leaned it against the wall. I went to the garage. The space between the lawnmower and the firewood was empty. No mirror, no mark on the wall where it had leaned, no disturbance in the dust on the floor. The mirror had moved from the garage to the hallway overnight without anyone carrying it and without leaving any evidence of the transit. I stood in front of the mirror, and I looked at my reflection, and my reflection looked back at me from a hallway that was too long and too dark, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child standing in that same hallway. The pull, the attraction, the sense that the mirror was not just reflecting the world but observing it, recording it, maintaining a version of the hallway that existed in the glass and only in the glass. A hallway that was longer and darker because it contained more time and more shadow than the physical hallway could hold. I didn't try to remove the mirror again. I live with it the way my grandmother lived with it, and the prophets lived with it, and the Hensleys probably lived with it before them. I walk past it every day. I look at it every day, and every day, the hallway in the mirror is slightly longer than the hallway in the house, and the doorways are slightly darker, and occasionally, at the very edge of the reflection, in the peripheral zone where the glass meets the frame, something moves. A shadow shifting, a door closing, the suggestion of a shape retreating around a corner that the mirror can see and I can't, pulling back from the edge of the reflection with the unhurried patience of something that has been almost seen for 120 years and is content to go on being almost seen for 120 more. The mirror watches. That's the simplest way I can say it. Not with malice, not with intent that I can detect. It watches the way the walls watch, the way the floorboards watch, the way old houses watch the people who live in them with the accumulated attention of every person who has walked the same hallway and opened the same doors and looked in the same glass. But the mirror holds what it sees. It keeps it. The hallway in the reflection is longer because it contains every version of the hallway that has ever existed, layered one on top of the other, 120 years of shadows and doors, and the shapes of people who walked past and glanced at the glass and saw something at the edge that they couldn't quite identify, and looked away and kept walking. The house cost me $22,000. That's what 5 years of vacancy and an estate sale in McDowell County will do to a property's value. Reduce it to a figure that sounds like a down payment in most of the country, but constitutes an outright purchase in a part of West Virginia that the economy left behind 2 generations ago. I'd been working at a sawmill in Welch and saving what I could, and when the listing appeared on the courthouse auction site, I drove out to look at it on a Saturday and made an offer the following Monday. It was a 3-bedroom on a secondary road about 4 miles outside of Marion, set into a hillside the way mountain houses are, the front at grade and the back elevated on a stone foundation that accommodated the slope. Built in the 40s, probably by the same family that had lived in it until the last owner died in 2018. A man named Lester Combs, who had been 87 and alone, and whose estate had taken 5 years to settle because his heirs were scattered and disinterested, and the lawyers in McDowell County move at the speed of the courts, which is to say slowly. The house had been sealed and left, the utilities disconnected, the furnishings removed by the estate, the rooms empty and still, gathering the particular flavor of abandonment that buildings develop when they're no longer inhabited, that stale, cold, mineral taste in the air that tells you the living have left and only the structure remains. I moved in that November and started renovations immediately. The house needed cosmetic work more than structural. New paint on the plaster walls, refinishing on the hardwood floors, updated light fixtures, and plumbing hardware. The bones were good. The foundation was dry. The roof, which had been metal since the 60s, showed no leaks. The windows were original double-hung wood sash, drafty but functional, and the doors were solid core on pin hinges that swung true. It was a well-built house that had been maintained with the pride of a generation that didn't throw things away when they broke, but fixed them and went on using them until fixing was no longer possible. I worked through the house room by room, starting with the kitchen and the living room, and moving to the 2 front bedrooms. Each room responded to the work the way old rooms do, coming alive under fresh paint and clean floors, the space brightening and warming as the evidence of neglect was removed and replaced with the evidence of care. I was living in the house while I worked, sleeping in whichever bedroom was finished enough to hold a mattress, and by the 3rd week, I'd completed the front rooms and the bathroom and was ready to start on the last room, the small bedroom at the back of the house. It was the smallest of the 3 bedrooms, maybe 10 by 12, with 1 window facing the hillside and a closet with a door that didn't quite latch. The room was at the rear of the house, the part that sat on the elevated foundation, and its exterior wall was built into the slope, which meant the hillside was less than 3 feet from the window. In daylight, the view from that window was a wall of earth and rock and the roots of the trees that grew on the hillside above. At night, it was black, the window showing nothing but the reflected interior of the room and the dark mass of the hill pressing against the glass. I noticed the cold the first time I opened the door. It hit me at the threshold, a wall of air that was dramatically, shockingly colder than the hallway behind me. Not the gradual chill of a room that hasn't been heated. Not the draft of air leaking through a bad window seal. This was a temperature boundary, a line in space where 68 degrees became something much less. The kind of abrupt transition you experience walking into a commercial refrigerator or stepping into a meat locker. I stood in the doorway and felt the cold air press against my face and my hands, and I instinctively stepped back. I thought the window was broken. That was the logical first response. A broken pane, a gap in the frame, cold air from the hillside pouring through the opening and filling the room. I walked in and checked. The window was intact, closed and latched, the glass unbroken, the frame sealed against the sash with the original weather stripping that had been compressed by decades of use but was still functional. No draft, no movement of air. The cold wasn't coming in from outside. It was already inside. It was in the room, the way furniture is in a room, present and stationary and occupying space. I put a thermometer on the dresser. The mercury settled at 42 degrees. I walked back to the hallway and checked the thermostat. 68. The furnace was running. The vents were producing warm air. The front bedrooms were comfortable. The kitchen and living room were comfortable. Only this room, the small bedroom at the back, was cold. 42 degrees cold. which is 36 degrees below a house where the furnace is functioning and the thermostat is set, and every other room is responding to the heat as expected. I checked everything I could think of. The vent in the room was open and producing warm air. I held my hand over it and felt heat, the same output as every other vent in the house. But the warm air didn't reach me. It left the vent and entered the room and vanished, absorbed by whatever was producing the cold, converted from warmth to nothing in the space between the vent and the center of the room. I closed the vent, and the temperature didn't change. I opened it fully, and the temperature didn't change. The cold was independent of the heating system. It existed on its own terms, drawing heat from the air and the walls and the floor and the objects in the room with an appetite that was insatiable and without apparent source. I checked the walls. Solid plaster on lath. No gaps, no moisture, no indication of structural compromise. I checked the floor. Hardwood over subfloor, over joists, the same construction as every other room. I checked the ceiling. Plaster, intact, no water stains, no cracks. The room was structurally identical to the front bedrooms, built from the same materials by the same hands in the same decade, and yet it was 26 degrees colder, as if the room contained something that consumed heat the way a fiber consumes oxygen, pulling the warmth out of the air and the surfaces with a hunger that was not diminished by the furnace or the insulation or the closed windows and doors. I called an HVAC technician from Welch, a man named Dobbins who'd been working heating and cooling systems in McDowell County for 30 years and who, according to the woman at the sawmill who recommended him, had seen everything that mountain houses could produce in terms of heating anomalies. Dobbins drove out on a Tuesday afternoon, a heavy-set man with a thermal imaging camera and a digital thermometer and the professional confidence of someone who fixes things for a living and fully expects to fix whatever I'd called him about. He stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and looked at his thermal camera. The screen showed the room in the blue and purple tones that indicate cold, a uniform field of low temperature that contrasted sharply with the yellows and oranges of the hallway behind him. He walked into the room, and I watched him react to the cold the way I had, the involuntary tightening of his shoulders, the slight hunch of a body adjusting to a temperature it doesn't expect. He swept the thermal camera across the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and the window. Everything was cold, uniformly, consistently cold, without the hot spots or cold spots that would indicate a draft, a structural gap, or a failing insulation layer. The room was just cold, all of it. Every surface, every cubic foot of air, every object within the four walls, at a temperature that his instruments confirmed was 41 degrees. He checked the vent, warm air. He checked the ductwork in the crawl space below, functional. He checked the insulation, what he could see of it, from the access panel in the hallway, adequate. He stood in the center of the room, and he looked at his equipment, and he looked at me, and his professional confidence was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of a man who has encountered something outside his expertise and is deciding how to say so without damaging his reputation. "There's no mechanical explanation for this," he said. "The heating system is working. The insulation is working. The building envelope is intact. This room should be 68 degrees. It's 41. He paused. "I don't know why," he said. And he left without charging me. I tried a space heater, a 1500-watt electric unit that I placed in the center of the room and ran it at full power for 4 hours. When I came back, the thermometer read 42 degrees. The space heater was running, producing heat that I could feel if I held my hand directly in front of the element, but the heat dissipated within inches. The room consumed it, took it in, and gave nothing back, the way a hole in the ground takes water, swallowing without filling. I closed the door. I decided that a 3-bedroom house could function as a 2-bedroom house, and that the back room would remain unused and closed, and whatever was wrong with it was a problem for someone with more knowledge or more courage than I had. I painted it. I refinished the floor. I did the cosmetic work because leaving the room unfinished felt like surrender, and I wasn't ready to surrender entirely. But I didn't sleep in it. I didn't use it. I closed the door, and I moved on. That was 4 months ago. The door has been shut since then. I walk past it every day on my way to the bathroom, and every day I put my hand flat against the wood of the door, and I feel it. The cold, pressing against the other side, transmitted through the solid core wood and into my palm, a chill that is deeper now than it was 4 months ago. The first week, the door was cool. The second week, it was cold. Now it's frigid. The wood itself has taken on the temperature of the room behind it, and the temperature of the room behind it has dropped. I don't open the door to check the thermometer anymore, but I don't need to. I can feel it. Whatever is in that room is getting colder. Not warmer, not stabilizing, not reaching an equilibrium with the surrounding house. Getting colder, progressively, steadily, as if whatever is consuming the heat in that room has not been satisfied by the heat that's available and is drawing from deeper sources, pulling warmth from the walls and the floor and the joists and the foundation and the earth itself. The wall between the back bedroom and the hallway is cold now, too. Not as cold as the door, but cold. I can feel it when I press my hand against the plaster, a chill that has seeped through from the bedroom and is advancing through the structure the way frost advances through soil, slow and patient and unconcerned with the barriers in its path. The hallway floor near the bedroom door is colder than the rest of the hallway. The bathroom, which shares a wall with the back bedroom, is cooler than it used to be, the tile floor cold enough to make me flinch when I step on it barefoot in the morning. It's spreading. Whatever is in that room is no longer contained by the door and the walls. It's moving through the structure, claiming territory 1 degree at a time, converting the warmth of the house into the cold of that room with the slow, methodical patience of something that has no deadline. And I lie in bed at night in the front bedroom, the room that's still warm, the room that's still mine, and I feel the cold pressing at the edges like water pressing at a dam. And I wonder how long the warmth will hold, and what happens when it doesn't. What happens when the entire house reaches 42 degrees, or 32, or 20? What happens when the cold that started in one room has consumed every room, and the furnace is running, and the space heaters are... My friend Colleen owns a cabin on a ridge in Avery County that she uses as a summer retreat and rents out the rest of the year through a vacation rental service. She bought it in 2019 from an elderly man who was moving to Florida. A small A-frame with a wraparound deck and a stone chimney and a view of the Blue Ridge that justified every inconvenience the property entailed, which included a 15-minute drive on gravel to reach the county road and a well that sometimes ran low in August, and a septic system that required more attention than Colleen's suburban upbringing had prepared her for. She loved the place. She talked about it constantly. The sunsets and the silence, and the particular way the light changed on the mountains through the seasons, and when she asked me to house sit for a week in November of 2023 while she traveled for work, I said yes immediately. I should say that I'm not a person who's easily unsettled. I'm 34, I work as a veterinary technician in Boone, and I've spent most of my adult life around animals and the practical realities of their care, which tends to ground a person in the physical world in a way that leaves little room for the imagined. I've house sat before, for friends and family, in remote locations and in town, and I've never had an experience that I couldn't explain through normal means. I'm telling you this because what happened at Colleen's cabin doesn't fit into the framework of normal means, and I need you to know that I've tried, genuinely and thoroughly tried, to make it fit. The cabin was everything Colleen described. Small but well-maintained, with a main room that combined the kitchen and living area, a sleeping loft above, and a bathroom tucked under the stairs. The deck wrapped around 3 sides, and the view from the front was a panorama of the Blue Ridge that stretched south toward Grandfather Mountain, the ridgeline running in blue-gray waves against the sky like a frozen ocean. The back of the cabin faced the tree line, a stand of hardwood and hemlock that started about 30 feet from the deck railing and climbed the ridge behind the property into unbroken forest that extended for miles. The first 2 nights were quiet. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, unpacked my bag, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and settled into the particular contentment that comes from being alone in a beautiful place with no obligations and no schedule. I read, I cooked simple meals. I sat on the deck in the afternoon and watched the light change on the mountains. The cabin was peaceful in the way that mountain cabins are peaceful. The silence not empty but full, layered with wind and bird song, and the creak of the building, and the faint sound of water running somewhere in the valley below. On the 3rd night, I went to bed around 11. The loft was warm from the fire below, and the sleeping bag was comfortable, and the rain that had started around sunset was a steady patter on the metal roof that should have put me to sleep within minutes. I drifted off listening to it. I woke at 1 in the morning, not from a dream, not from a noise that startled me. I woke because I heard my name, my actual name, spoken aloud, clearly, from outside the cabin. From the woods behind the property, the tree line that started 30 feet from the back deck climbed the ridge into darkness. My name, 2 syllables, spoken with a rising inflection at the end that turned it into a question. The way you'd call someone to dinner, the way you'd call a child in from the yard, the way my mother calls me. I need to be specific about this because it's the detail that makes the rest of the story either terrifying or explainable, and I've spent 2 years trying to decide which. The voice was my mother's, not similar to my mother's, not a generic female voice that I interpreted as my mother's because I was half asleep and disoriented. It was her voice, the exact pitch, the exact cadence, the exact timbre, the slight upward inflection at the end of my name that she's used since I was a child, the particular music of a voice I've been hearing for 34 years, as recognizable to me as my own heartbeat. I sat up in the loft. The fire below had burned to embers, and the cabin was dim. The only light, the faint red glow from the hearth, and the gray of the rain-clouded sky, visible through the windows. I listened. Silence. The rain on the roof. The creak of the cabin. Then the voice again. My name. Same pitch, same cadence, same inflection. Coming from the same direction, the woods behind the cabin, maybe 40 or 50 feet into the tree line, at a height that suggested a person standing on level ground. I reached for my phone. I called my mother. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep, confused and slightly annoyed in the way that parents are when their adult children call them at 1 in the morning. I asked her where she was. She said she was in bed, in her house, in Asheville, where she'd been all evening. I asked if she was sure. She said, "Of course, I'm sure. What's wrong?" I said, "Nothing's wrong." I said, "I just wanted to check." She said, "You're being strange," and told me to go back to sleep and hung up. My mother was in Asheville, 45 minutes away, asleep in her house, and outside the cabin, in the dark woods on a ridge in Avery County, something was calling my name in her voice. It was called again while I was still holding the phone. My name, rising at the end, the inflection perfect, the voice indistinguishable from the woman I'd just spoken to. I climbed down from the loft and went to the kitchen window, the one that faced the back of the property and the tree line beyond. The rain was steady, obscuring the view, but the woods were visible as a dark mass beyond the deck, the individual trees distinguishable only in their closest rank, the rest lost in the layered darkness of a mountain forest at night. The voice called again, 30 seconds after the last time. Same name, same voice, same direction, spaced with a regularity that felt deliberate, as if whatever was producing the sound had settled into a rhythm and intended to maintain it. I stood at the window, and I listened, and I counted. 30 seconds between calls, every call identical, no variation in pitch, volume, or timing. A recording would have shown the same consistency, but this wasn't a recording. The voice had spatial quality, depth, height, H and direction, and the subtle acoustic properties of a sound produced in the open air and traveling through rain and trees to reach me. It was a voice being produced in real time, from a specific location, by something that had the physical capacity to replicate my mother's speech patterns with an accuracy that I could not distinguish from the original. I didn't go outside. I want to be clear about that. I stood at the kitchen window, and I looked at the dark woods, and I listened to my mother's voice calling my name from a place where my mother was not, and I did not open the door. Not because I'm brave, not because I reasoned through the situation and concluded that going outside was dangerous, because my body wouldn't let me. Every time I thought about reaching for the door handle, a feeling rose in my chest that I can only describe as prohibition, a deep, pre-verbal refusal that came from the same part of my brain that knows not to walk off a cliff or put my hand in a fire. My body knew, before my mind had finished processing, that the voice was wrong. That whatever was using my mother's voice to call my name from the tree line at 1 in the morning was not my mother and was not something I wanted to be closer to. The calling continued for 45 minutes. I counted the intervals, 30 seconds, every time. My name in my mother's voice, rising at the end, patient and steady and completely unwavering, as if whatever was producing the sound could do so indefinitely, as if the calling was not an effort but a function, a thing it did the way a cricket chirps or a frog calls, automatic and tireless and driven by something other than conscious intention. At 1:45 it stopped. The last call hung in the air for a moment, and then the rain absorbed it. Tea in the woods were silent, and the voice was gone. Not gradually, not fading with distance, just gone. The way a machine stops when you turn it off. Present and then absent, with nothing in between. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the cabin turned on, and I listened to the rain, and I waited for the voice to come back. It didn't. The rest of the night was ordinary. The rain and the wind and the cabin sounds, and by the time the first gray light of morning crept through the windows, I had almost convinced myself that I'd experienced a particularly vivid episode of auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and poor sleep and the suggestive acoustics of a mountain ridge and rain. Then I went outside. The rain had stopped around 4, and the ground was soft and dark, the leaf litter on the forest floor holding the moisture like a sponge. I walked to the edge of the tree line, to the spot I estimated the voice had been coming from based on its direction and distance from the kitchen window. The woods at that point were open enough to see maybe 20 feet in, the understory thin, the trees spaced far enough apart that a person could walk between them without difficulty. There were no footprints. The soft ground showed no boot prints, no shoe impressions, no marks of any kind that would indicate a person had been standing there, no tracks leading in from the ridge, no tracks leading out. The ground was undisturbed except in one spot. About 10 feet into the tree line, directly in front of the position where the voice had been loudest, the leaves on the ground were pressed flat, a patch about 4 feet in diameter, where the leaf litter had been compressed against the soil, pushed down by the weight of something that had been sitting, or crouching, or resting there for a long time. The impression was deep, the leaves matted into a dense layer that held its shape when I pressed on it, the kind of compression that requires sustained weight, not a brief contact but an extended stay. Whatever had been sitting in that spot had been there for at least the duration of the calling, 45 minutes, pressing its weight into the ground, while it produced my mother's voice, and directed it at the cabin, where I stood at the window, listening. I left that morning, packed my bag, locked the cabin, drove down the gravel road and onto the county route, and back to Boone. I called Colleen and told her I had an emergency at work and couldn't finish the week. She was understanding. She didn't ask for details. I haven't told her what happened because telling her would mean either she doesn't believe me and the friendship is strained, or she does believe me and she never goes back to the cabin, and neither outcome feels right. I've talked to people in the area, not about my specific experience, but about the phenomenon in general, asking carefully, indirectly, the way you ask about something you're afraid to know the answer to. An older woman in Banner Elk told me the mountains have things in them that can mimic. She said it casually, the way you'd mention that certain plants are poisonous, or certain mushrooms shouldn't be eaten. She said, they learn the voices of the people you love, because those are the voices you'll follow. She said they call from the tree line because the tree line is the boundary. Why? And they need you to cross it. She said they're patient. They'll call for hours. They'll come back the next night and the next. They'll use every voice you've ever trusted until they find the one that makes you open the door. I asked her, what happens if you open the door? She looked at me for a long Tanya then. She said, people go missing in these mountains every year. Not many, but some. And the ones who go missing are almost always alone. And they almost always go at night. And nobody ever finds them. She said it the way mountain people say things that they know are true and that they know you won't believe. She said it, and then she changed the subject, and I let her because I didn't want to hear anymore. I haven't been back to Colleen's cabin. I live in Boone, in a duplex on a street with neighbors and street lights and the ambient noise of a town that never quite goes silent. And on certain nights, usually when I'm falling asleep, usually when the house is quiet and the wind is moving through the trees that line the street, I hear it, faint, distant, barely distinguishable from the wind itself. My name, in my mother's voice, rising at the end, the way she calls me, the way something that is not my mother calls me, from whatever ridge or tree line or dark place it occupies, patient and tireless, waiting for the night. I'm alone enough and tired enough and trusting enough to open the door and step outside and follow the voice of someone I love into the woods where no one will find me.